Gib, does this work? If I talk to you real quiet like this, Gib, can you hear me? So can everybody else. Good. We're broadcasting live to the planet. All right. Well, let's do stuff. So, thanks for coming, folks. Welcome to it, and on a rainy day. A couple quick announcements. November 10th is our next colloquium. Kelly Rice will be talking about health stuff. It's cancer, right? I didn't have the thing. MJ, do you remember what, is it on her kids and cancer thing? Research that she's been doing. So, yeah, Kelly Rice from Health is going to be talking about her research on November 10th. Same bat place, same bat time, bat stuff. The other thing is the Wallawa-Whitman Charter Ranger District kickoff party, let's call it, is right after this at 5 o'clock in the LOSO lobby, where I've been told they won't have mozzarella sticks, but they will have fresh cruddites. I'm pretty sure I nailed the pronunciation of that thing. In response to what are cruddites, they said at least they're fresh and not stale. So everybody's invited to have a cruddite and a visit. At 5 over in the LOSO, lobby over there. So come on over. Other than that, today we have Mandy. Originally from Columbia Falls, Montana, a small town outside of Glacier National Park. And she did her undergraduate at the University of Montana, which is quite unfortunate, I have to say, as a proud Montana state.
Oh, no. You didn't tell me you were a Bobcat.
Go Bobcats. Oh, I didn't tell you that? I didn't mention that?
Conveniently.
It's weird, and I'm the one with the mic. Mandy took 3 years off on a real job to find out that she hated insurance work. So she went to Washington State University for a master's and PhD in history. Last year, she was a lecturer at Central Washington University, and she's interested in the relationship between war trauma and commemoration, specifically in regions like Ireland. And with that, forgetting to remember, and Mandy Link, folks.
Thank you. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming on this kind of dreary Thursday afternoon. So, as he said, my research talk today is forgetting to remember Irish commemoration of the First World War. And I want to start out by way of a story, which I always think is the best way to start out. And I want to talk about this group in Europe called Europeana. It's this amazing project that's a partnership with Oxford University. And what they started doing in the years leading up to the centennial anniversaries of World War I is they said, you know, there is a lot of World War I material culture as well as documentation that people still hold in their families that, you know, scholars don't have access to, that, you know, they don't really want to part with. It has a lot of family meaning. They don't want to donate it to a museum, but man, that information would be so great for scholars. So they instituted the Europeana 1914 to 1918 project. And what they did is they would go around to major European cities and they would put out a call and say, you know, we're going to be in London, or in this case, Dublin, on such and such a day. Bring your family's World War I items to usually an archive or a museum, and they would take pictures and document the family story about those items. And so they were in Dublin in March of 2012, which is great for me because their website is a treasure trove of items that I would ordinarily never have access to. But a couple of the items I think are really, really telling in their story and kind of lead into my research really well, is the items of a man named William Andrews. And his son, Michael, brought these in to Europeana. So he brought in a bunch of medals from the war that had been his father's, as well as you can see here kind of a rusted over World War I helmet. And what you can't see very well from this picture is that over here, there's a dent. And Michael told the Europeana team that this dent was actually created by a bullet going right into William's helmet. And the story that Michael told was, had this bullet gone 1 inch to the left or the right, his father would have died. And therefore, he never would have existed, his siblings, etc. Now, that's not an unusual story. We get a lot of those, World War I, World War II. But this meant a lot to the Andrews family. They had kept these items. They were, you know, a source of pride. Now, when he brought these items in, Michael also told the team that kind of more about his father's post-war experience. And he said that after the war was over in 1918, his dad was actually granted a commission in the British Army. Now that was really rare in 1918. Most of the British Army, when the war was over, was demobilized. The British Army could not continue to pay for an army of that size anymore. I mean, by the end of the war, they were broke and borrowing money from the US, so they really didn't want to have a big army. So the fact that William had a commission in the British Army was a pretty big deal, especially as an Irishman. But he had some reservations. He was really glad about the fact that this was steady financial income. But on the other hand, he could see, leading into 1919, that the British and the Irish were about to go to war with each other over the question of Irish independence. And so he had some real ethical concerns that if he took this commission, he would ultimately be fighting against his fellow Irish countrymen. So he ultimately turned down this well-paying, steady job in the British Army and went back to Ireland. And his son commented that, quote, "This was true patriotism to Ireland. It was not a public gesture that would attract recognition, much less admiration." And I think what William's story really does well is it shows the choices that were posed to Irish veterans of World War I after the war. They really ended up having two stark choices. They could choose Ireland, or they could choose the British Empire. Now, Ireland had obviously been in the British Empire for centuries by this point. I'm sure many of you are acquainted with the fact the Irish had tried to gain independence multiple times, lots of rebellions. But having kind of an Irish identity and a British identity, they weren't mutually exclusive. You could be, an Irishman who wanted independence and also be a British soldier. And no one would have thought those two things were strange up until World War I. World War I changes that, as we'll see today, partially because of the subsequent fight for independence, the Irish Civil War, and the connection of the British Empire with kind of everything bad in Ireland. The British Empire and everything about it, everything remotely British, becomes vilified, and that's going to include Irish veterans of World War I. Now, World War I, as I'm sure many of you know, lasts 4 years, 1914 until 1918. It ultimately claims the lives of 8.5 million soldiers. That's the equivalent of the modern populations of the states of Washington and Idaho being killed in a 4-year span of time. Additionally, 21 million soldiers are wounded and returned to their homes, and we'll see again how that affects Irish soldiers. I would argue no soldiers of World War I returned without some sort of scarring, even if it wasn't physical. They were only just beginning to understand what we now call PTSD, but I would again argue all of them came home with deep scars from this experience. Now, when people talk about World War I, it's really easy to focus on, kind of the big hitters: Britain, France, Germany, the impacts on Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution. And you can look at Ireland and say, it's this small island. How impactful could its contribution have been? It's small population, small geographically. But in terms of Ireland, it's actually quite impactful. A little over 200,000 Irishmen voluntarily enlisted. Now, I've put voluntarily in italics to emphasize it because every Irishman that served in World War I voluntarily enlisted. There is no conscription in Ireland during World War I. That is not the case for Britain, Germany, France. They all had conscription. So each one of those men voluntarily chose to fight. Now, most of them signed up for the pay. The British Army paid very well. At the beginning of the war, there's a sense of adventure. This would allow them to travel. A lot of these Irishmen come from very poor economic situations, so this was a way out. Of course, they didn't know this was going to last 4 years and be the bloodiest war the world had seen to that point. There is still that sense, especially in the early months of 1914, that you wanted to get in and go before it was all over. Now, obviously, that has worn off by halfway through the war. But when we're talking about 200,000, you could say, okay, well, you just told us 8.5 million people died, 21 million are wounded. What's 200,000? I mean, not to be kind of crass, but right, what is 200,000 when you're dealing with millions? Well, as you can see here, 200,000 represents 40% of the young men who were of the right age and healthy enough to serve voluntarily chose to go. And 40% of your young male population, that's nothing to sniff at. That's a significant chunk of your young population. Between 30 and 50,000 of them were killed in the war. So that means you have roughly about 150,000 that survived the war experience. About 50,000 of those survivors emigrate to Canada, the US, Australia. So we have roughly 100,000 that will return to Ireland and experience what we're going to see today. Now, in the early months of the war, there is quite a bit of support in Ireland for the war effort. There's this kind of idea of pulling together, right? Everybody doing their bit to support the war effort. But that starts to break down. It starts to break down in 1915 after the Battle of Gallipoli, when we have whole units of Irishmen who are killed. They usually enlisted in family groups, brothers, cousins, etc. They would also enlist in sporting groups. So you have entire soccer teams that would enlist together and they would be put in the same unit. So when that unit was destroyed in battles like Gallipoli or the Somme, that means an entire neighborhood lost an entire generation of young men. So when we start to see those big casualty lists, we start to see this downturn in support for the war, which is understandable. But the real thing that breaks the support for the war is the Easter Rising in 1916. Now this happens in April of 1916. This is a rebellion by a group of Irishmen who are attempting to force the British into granting Ireland independence. Prior to the war, the British Parliament had passed the Home Rule Bill, which was supposed to make Ireland kind of like a Commonwealth state, so like Australia or Canada at the time, where Ireland would get its own parliament, its own prime minister, but would still be kind of in the realm of the empire. But once World War I broke out, the British said, we don't really have time or effort for this. We're going to back burner this until the war is over. And so halfway through the war, a group of Irishmen are saying, this isn't good enough for us. So they launched this rebellion. It's ultimately a failure. It lasts a week. The British Army is sent in to put it down. Ironically, many members of the British Army that go in to put down the rebellion are themselves Irishmen, who will later recount that they felt that they were on the wrong side of history in putting down this rebellion. So the rebellion, even though it's a failure, it becomes this moment for Irish people of standing up to the British Empire, and the British Army's response to it was seen as really draconian, and it turned the tide of Irish perceptions of the war and the empire itself, and saying, okay, we have to be independent. We can't support this war anymore. We can't support the empire. We want out. And so in 1918, when the war does end, again, as I said at the beginning, we start to see the Irish moving towards war against Britain to actually attain that independence that they'd honestly been trying to get for several centuries. Now this leads to the War of Independence. It's also called the Anglo-Irish War, and it lasts 1919 to 1921. So the Irish and the British essentially go from one war right into another war. Although the British will never effectively declare war, because it would have been political suicide to come out of World War I and then declare war again. So they consider this to be, I guess, kind of like how here Vietnam was never declared as an official war, kind of the same thing as how the British saw it. But it pits the Irish Republican forces against the British forces. Now, one caveat here that I think is always helpful to keep in mind when talking about Irish history is that when we talk about Republican, it has nothing to do with the American version of republicanism. In this election season, it can be hard to separate ourselves from American politics, but it's very different. In Ireland, Republicans simply refer to those members who were fighting for a republic. So really people who were fighting to be outside the British Empire. So it pits those Republicans against the British forces. And what's going to be interesting in terms of World War I is that you would think, okay, you're going into this war, you would think that the Irish forces that they would want to use World War I vets, right? They're militarily trained. A lot of them ended up taking their rifles home with them after the war so that they would have more military training than, say, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. But the IRA didn't want them. The IRA said, yeah, we don't care that you're militarily trained. Our concern is that you just got out of the British Army. And the IRA felt that these were not real Irishmen anymore, that these guys had given up their national identity by voluntarily enlisting in the British Army. So that voluntary service comes back to bite them during the War of Independence. Now on the other side, you would think, oh, the British forces, they could make use of these Irish vets. Again, they're militarily trained. They already know literally the drills of the British Army. But the British Army didn't want them either because they said, you're Irish. We can't count on you. Your loyalty's in question. You're Irish and you're always going to be Irish, and therefore you're probably just going to spy on us for the IRA. So the identities of who these veterans were was constantly contested and identified by other people. The IRA saying, no, you're not really Irish, and the British are saying, no, you're too Irish. So they're constantly being, again, redefined by people around them and not really having a chance to define themselves. Now, during the War of Independence, this clash in identities actually becomes very violent. While many World War I vets will try to downplay their service, not really mention it, we all live in a small town. You know how hard that is, right? Especially if you grew up in a small town, they would go back to it. Everybody knew where you'd been during the war. It's not that easy to hide it. Although there is one really interesting case of a World War I vet who buried his British Army uniform in a peat bog. And it was actually dug up, I think like 10 years ago, perfectly preserved because it was a peat bog. And so that shows you some of the lengths they were willing to go to hide their service. Now, unfortunately, during the War of Independence, because these World War I veterans didn't really get to side with the British or the IRA, they were stuck in the middle. And so what happens is a lot of times they ended up becoming targets of violence because of that. So one case of that is a guy named Eugene O'Connell. He had survived the Western Front, which is no small feat in and of itself. And when he came home, he married a woman named Elizabeth O'Brien. And she was from this very prominent Republican family. All her brothers were in the IRA. They were very, very active in the War of Independence. Now, O'Connell never officially joined the IRA. He never expressed any Republican sentiments or IRA leanings. We do know that he helped train some of his brothers-in-law, but that's about as far as he got into the IRA itself. What happens is that in the town they lived in, one of the British sergeants stationed there was assassinated by the IRA. And so then the British forces decide to take revenge. And they know that the O'Briens are this prominent Republican family and they're in the IRA. So in the middle of the night, they storm into the O'Briens' house and they kill everyone in the house, including Eugene. So he's killed not because he had ever been active in the IRA or had expressed any IRA sentiments. In fact, we know his IRA brothers-in-law were very leery of him being even in the house because he had been a vet of World War I. But he's killed simply by association. He married into this family, and unfortunately that ended up costing his life. Now on the flip side, the IRA did the exact same thing. They actually singled out a guy named Watson and another named Sherlock, ironically. But they singled them out because they were suspicious of them for being World War I vets, but they also thought that they were spies for the British forces. So they were actually gunned down in the middle of the street in broad daylight, again, based on suspicion, because they'd been veterans of World War I in the British Army. That was really the only reason that they were killed. So again, World War I vets could be targeted by either side simply because of their previous war service and the perceptions of that by either the IRA or the British forces. Now, the War of Independence ends in 1921 with a treaty with the British. And in that treaty, Ireland is permanently partitioned into what we now know as Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It also gave the Republic a certain amount of independence. They were going to get a parliament and they would get a president, but they were still within the empire. And a lot of those Republicans that had just fought 2 years for independence said, this isn't good enough. We want full and total independence from the empire, and we want the island to be united. We don't want this separation. Other groups of Republicans said, this is the best we're going to get. Let's take the deal, and we can work from here to get, in the long term, those other things that we want. And the disagreement over the treaty, again, whether or not to leave Ireland separated, led to a civil war, which ended in 1923. So what that means is, by 1923, Ireland has been at war in some form or another for almost a decade. Now, what that means in terms of World War I is that by 1924, so the first year after all this war is over, by 1924, this is the first time that Ireland will attempt to commemorate the First World War. Now, London, Paris, Berlin, even in the United States, there had been World War I commemorations since the end of the war. So the Irish are about 6 years late to this game. Now, with some of the problems that begin in this newly independent Ireland, which at the time was called the Irish Free State, some of the problems that begin is that this newly independent Irish government says, we're trying to set up a new state. We need to be completely independent of the British as much as we can. And the last thing we want to be seen doing politically is paying for the care of disabled veterans from World War I. They say, Ireland was under the British Empire. You fought in the British Army. That means you need to go ask Britain for money. We are not going to pay for that. Now, when veterans of World War I in Ireland do try to ask the British government for money, the British government says, nah, you guys wanted independence, pay for it yourselves. So Irish veterans don't have access to what we would call VA benefits. Again, anytime they try and get them from the British government, it's a pretty difficult battle to win. And we also have to keep in mind that all of these returning soldiers have, whether it's PTSD, which they would have called shell shock, which they didn't really yet understand. I'm sure many people would say we still don't really understand it in a really great way. Or they were coming back with amputations, oftentimes multiple amputations, physical scarring from chemical warfare. A lot of them came back with severe issues in their lungs from breathing in mustard and phosgene gas. So the fact that these men were coming back, there's no real veterans benefits for them, and most of them can't work, right? If you're a double amputee and you were a farmer before the war, right, your livelihood is gone, and there are no real benefits for you. And again, the government's not willing to pay for them because they don't see it as being an Irish war. Now, they do pay veterans benefits for Irish veterans of the War of Independence because they say, oh, you were fighting for Ireland, yeah, we'll pay benefits for you. So again, they're kind of caught in the middle and unfortunately don't receive any real benefits. Now, as I said, 1924 is the first year they try to have any large-scale commemorative events on Armistice Day, November 11th. This is a picture of the first Armistice Day event in Dublin. As you can see, it's a huge crowd of people. It was far more than they expected. It actually clogged up the streets so bad that it stopped traffic in downtown Dublin for the entire day. And there are all these funny editorials from the following days of especially lawyers and bankers whining about how it disrupted their business for the whole day. It's kind of funny. But it was largely attended, and interestingly, it's not targeted by the IRA. You see very little pushback from the IRA. And so some people started to say, hey, maybe this is a sign that we're through all this war, we're starting to rebuild Ireland. Maybe we can all kind of unite and coalesce around this World War I commemoration, because there were soldiers from both Protestant and Catholic religions that fought, from both sides of the political situation that fought, and they thought maybe this could be a unifier after a war of independence and a civil war. Sadly and unfortunately, that was not to be the case. The 1920s and 30s ended up being an incredibly dangerous period for World War I veterans. One aspect of the pushback on World War I comes in the symbols of the war. And one of those symbols is the Flanders Poppy. Now, the Flanders Poppy came to represent the World War I experience across Europe, here in the United States. I mean, still, when Veterans Day rolls around in a little over a week and a half, you'll see people wearing these. It's still a symbol of Veterans Day, but it began in World War I. Because the poppy grew fairly well in the French and Belgian battlefields. And so you have all these accounts of soldiers who would go out across no man's land, which was just mud and barbed wire and, looks like something from a horror film. And they would occasionally find these poppies. So it was this thing of beauty and a thing of utter destruction. And so it comes to represent the war. And what happens afterwards is groups like the Royal British Legion, groups in France, Germany, here in the US, they use this symbol and begin to manufacture these fake poppies for people to wear. And they would sell them as a way to bring in money so that they could then help out those disabled soldiers. So this is a nonprofit group. Well, what happens in Ireland is a lot of Republicans, the IRA, say, no, that's not a symbol of the war. That's a symbol of British imperial oppression, and we won't stand for it. Now, if it had just been a matter of rhetoric and them being grumpy, that would be one thing. But what they start doing is they start targeting people who are wearing a poppy. So that might be a veteran, that might be a family member who'd lost a loved one. That could just be someone who wanted to commemorate the war. It didn't matter. If you were wearing a poppy, to them you were fair game. We have evidence of them destroying, burning down poppy depots where they would store them before they sold them in Ireland. People would oftentimes get beat up in the streets if they were wearing a poppy. Some were killed, although not a large number. And again, it didn't matter if you were a veteran or, and it didn't matter on gender lines either. If you were a woman and you were wearing a poppy, you could be accosted as well. I mean, the least horrible thing that could happen to you is that they would yell at you that you were, an imperialist or you loved Britain or something. And that was, again, kind of best case scenario. In the 1930s, there's actually an account of a car being flipped over on a Dublin street by a mob with people in it because it had a poppy on the front of the car. So again, people are very angry. They're angry at the British Empire, and they're angry at people who want to commemorate a war that they see as a British war. Whereas these people just want to commemorate. Oftentimes, in their accounts, they're saying, well, my dad died. My husband died, my son, my brother. I just want to recognize what happened to them. And it becomes increasingly difficult to do. There's one account, this is from a bit later in the 1950s, but a guy, his dad had died in World War I, and he would say that on Armistice Day, he would wear a poppy while he was at church for the church service on Remembrance Day. And as soon as he left the church, he would take the poppy off so he didn't get beaten up or accosted by, again, Republicans or the IRA. So even just a symbol of the Great War becomes difficult, let alone, again, dealing with the actual veterans themselves. Now, another example of how difficult it was for the Irish to integrate World War I is in trying to build a national war memorial. Now, other countries had done this fairly quickly. Britain builds the cenotaph in Whitehall by 1920. They also build a tomb to the unknown soldier in Westminster Abbey by 1920. So, and the US has some as well. So the Irish were kind of playing catch up again. Now, the first proposal for a National War Memorial was in 1919. And they wanted to build a disabled veterans home so that, veterans who didn't have family members to take care of them but also couldn't work would have a place where they could be taken care of. And they'd raised about £50,000 privately to pay for this. So all they needed was government approval to build it. And the government said, no, we're not interested in doing this. And they cited that, well, you don't have any plans for long-term funding, which was, a fairly understandable reason for denying the request. So Then in 1924, the committee comes forward and says, okay, we want to build a monument now. We've changed our idea. We want to build a monument with our 50,000 pounds, and we want to build it in Marion Square, which is pictured here. Now, for those of you who have been to Dublin, Marion Square, you probably remember, it's beautiful, but it's also very close to the heart of Dublin. And that created some problems for this proposal, because people said, okay, you want to put it here. Well, Marion Square is actually really close to all the main government buildings. And people said, you know, it's very concerning to us if visitors come to Ireland or future generations, they're going to look at the location of a World War I monument here and the government buildings here and say, oh, there's some connection there. That if the government endorsed this, they must be saying World War I was important to us as a state. And that's not that hard to, wrap your mind around. Think about the National Mall in DC, right? Everything that goes on the National Mall has had to meet extensive approval because it says something about who the United States is and what we hold dear about our history. So it's the same concern that a lot of people had here. And the government said no, resoundingly no to this proposal because they were worried that if they put this monument here, people would assume that the Irish state had something to do with World War I. So they denied the request in 1927. And impressively, this committee is stonewalled but undaunted, and they kind of push forward. And they say, okay, how about we build a stone archway, right? So they're kind of scaling it back from a full monument. Say, okay, we'll build a stone archway instead, and we'll put it in Phoenix Park, which Phoenix Park is huge. It's actually twice the size of Central Park in New York City. And at the time, it was on the edge of Dublin. I mean, it's still not exactly close to the city center. It's still kind of on the outskirts. And they said, okay, can we just put up a stone archway in this distant park away from the city center? And the government said, no, yet again, because they did not want to be the ones to agree to build a monument to World War I. So a lot of politicians saw this as potential political suicide if they were seen allying themselves or approving this. Now finally, they get approved. Eventually, I think their persistence wore down the government, and they get to build their monument at the Island Bridge portion of Phoenix Park. So this is an aerial view here. This is actually not that easy to find. It's very hidden. The first time I went to go see it, I got lost. And it's not just because I'm bad with directions. I got lost because the signage is terrible. I mean, so even today in the 21st century, this is still not a major tourist attraction. It's not on most tourist maps even, so I don't think a lot of tourists even know it exists. So you enter, you come in along here through these trees, and then you come up this walkway. There's a plinth here, and then two huge gardens on either side. So it's quite sizable. And then when you enter in, here's the plinth that says, "Their name liveth forevermore." And on the back around that cross, it cites the 49,500 soldiers who died in the war. Now, I think if you just happened upon this, you probably wouldn't necessarily know it was for the First World War. You'd have to, again, even if you just thought "their name liveth forevermore," you'd probably realize it was a monument, but it's not saying World War I, the Great War. It doesn't have dates on it. It's fairly nondescript. Now, they started building this in 1932. It's finished in 1939. And it was supposed to have this grand opening on Armistice Day, November 1939. But if you know your world history, World War II had already begun in the fall of 1939. And so the president, Eamon de Valera, who was a fierce anti-imperialist, kind of cited the world situation and said, oh, it'd be bad form if we had some big commemorative event. And so they canceled the opening of the monument. It is used after that up through the 1940s for commemorative events, but it really falls into disrepair, unfortunately. By the early 1980s, it's pretty much falling apart. Luckily, I think I have a picture. Here's a close-up picture of the gardens. Luckily, by the late 1980s, a nonprofit group undertook to repair it. So now it is back in its original state. Again, it's quite beautiful. If you're in Dublin, I highly encourage you to go on the adventure of trying to find it because, again, it's really beautiful, it's really serene, and it's an interesting sight, especially now that you know the story of how long it took to get built. But what the monument does is it shows us, I mean, this took over 20 years to get this done, to have a national memorial. And it's on the outskirts of Dublin. To this day, it's still hard to find. And what that shows us is just how much the government, and kind of with an assist from the public, is pushing World War I, literally pushing World War I out of the center of Ireland, right? They're pushing it out of the center, but they're also pushing it away from any sort of central place in the Irish national identity that's emerging or the Irish history. In fact, many people that I've talked to when I've gone to do research have said, even people my age have said, I didn't learn about this. I didn't even know Ireland served in World War I. So it definitely ends up being a very forgotten thing, again, being pushed out the way that it has. But despite that, despite the anger and the violence and the pushing away of World War I, there are people who find their own ways to commemorate the war itself. And they do this in more private and personal ways. Now, private and personal memory of war is not unique to Ireland, nor is it unique to World War I. I mean, it happens with every war in any region. But what happens in Ireland is that people, as they're trying to wear poppies or go to a parade and they're getting yelled at, beaten up, you're not going to keep doing that, right? I mean, that's eventually going to turn you away. But they still want to remember their loved ones who died, perhaps their loved ones who returned, right? They still want a way to commemorate. And one thing that's important to point out here is that after World War I, the British government did not repatriate bodies from the battlefield. So any soldier who served in the British Army that fell in World War I is buried where they fell, as close to where they fell. So they're in France, Belgium, Gallipoli, etc. So these people who lost husbands and fathers and sons, they didn't have a grave, they didn't get to have a funeral, these sort of customary ways that we as human beings mourn the dead. They didn't get those. And so a lot of times these big national monuments kind of served as a surrogate grave for those people, a place you could go and have that moment. And so Ireland, taking over 20 years to get this done, doesn't really have that space. And so people create their own sort of surrogate sites where they can remember and commemorate the people they cared about. A couple examples. One is for William O'Keefe, who died fighting in France in May of 1917. His mom collected every letter that he had ever sent her, that was ever sent to her. Once a soldier died in battle, it was very common for other members of the unit, other officers, even the chaplain of the unit, to write to that person's family. And so she collected all those letters and kept them, preserved them. We see that a lot with World War I. But his family also commissioned a stained glass window from the renowned stained glass artist Harry Clark. And so he designed this window at the Church of the Assumption, a Catholic church in Wexford, which was his hometown. It's dedicated in 1920, so only 2 years after the war is over. And as you can it might be kind of hard to see in the background, but it's a very religious scene. It's the Madonna and Child. We have St. Aidan and St. Adrian over here. It's not an overtly military depiction. If you just looked at it in passing, you probably wouldn't even think about, oh, this is for a soldier who died in World War I. There is a notation to him that honors William down here, but it's very tiny. It notes him, his unit, when he died, and then it says, in hoping that God will grant him eternal peace. It also has the Latin phrase for where duty and glory lead. But what's interesting about this is that there's no framing of this. Its glory and duty are fairly vague terms. It's not saying he fought for the British or for king and country or for Ireland. It's saying, for glory and duty. So I think, unfortunately, the O'Keefe family unfortunately does not have any sort of great statement that says this is what we meant by that, which would help every historian ever if somebody just wrote that down. But I would argue what it indicates is they weren't trying to couch it in any sort of political terms. You know, they're seeing 1928, we're at the height of the War of Independence. They're not going to say this is for king and country. I mean, that would be crazy in 1920. It's couching it in religious terms, right? And especially in Ireland in the early 20th century, religion, whether it be Protestantism or Catholicism, was a focal point of every community. So this would have been his church where he was baptized, where he worshiped, you know, where, you know, big life events happens, where you get married, where your funeral is. And so I would argue that every time his family saw this window, it would have been a way for them to remember him and commemorate him. And we have many other of those in other churches, in both Protestant and Catholic churches. This window here is called the Angel of Peace and Hope. It's for Clifford Lloyd, who was killed in France in 1915. Now, these are obviously things that the fairly wealthy can do. I mean, if you're, you know, kind of a working class family, you can't afford to buy a stained glass window in a church. But what you can do is create your own ways of remembering. So one great story I came across is a guy named Bartholomew Hand, which, if you ask me, is one of the best names you could ever come across in the historical record. And what he would do, he had survived the Battle of Gallipoli, which was a notoriously, infamously bad and costly battle. And what he would do is, around early November, so, you know, kind of now-ish, he would take his son on a bike ride around Dublin. And they would always stop at this same cemetery where several of his friends who had also survived the war had now been buried. A lot of World War I vets did not make it that far out of the 1920s and 30s, especially the ones who had breathed in a lot of the gases, unfortunately, cut their lives a bit shorter. So they would visit this cemetery, and he would tell his son all these stories about the war. He would sing songs from the war, and that's the only time he would ever talk about the war, was this once-a-year kind of pilgrimage he made to this cemetery. And his son said that it wasn't until he was much older that he realized that was his dad's commemorative moment. That was his dad's way of remembering his friends who died, the ones who came back and died earlier than him, and a way of passing that down to his son, to the next generation. So again, you find these kind of amazing stories kind of here and there of people finding other ways. They're not doing big scale memorials, they're not writing memoirs about it, they're just finding ways to commemorate the experience and to understand the war in the best way that they could. So that's actually it. Thank you all so much. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
And if you have a question, I'll bring you the mic so folks can hear it at home. All the way over there.
I was wondering if there was any, when the veterans couldn't get services in the Dublin area, was there any sort of migration to the north that you know of?
Good question. Not amongst Catholics. They were definitely going to stay put. There was a huge amount of Protestant migration after the Free State was created, but that was more due to the creation of Northern Ireland and still being within the UK system, and less about services being accessible to them, unfortunately. Now, if an Irishman ended up going to live in Britain for work or something like that, they did have a much easier time accessing VA services.
Chris, come back. Need my exerciser.
You're good. Okay. I'm interested in the way unresolved historical trauma, whether from war or genocide or other forms of mass suffering, propagate themselves through subsequent generations that didn't actually live through it. we can think of many examples, so I won't bother. You can think of your own. Is it possible that the enormous trauma Ireland went through with the potato famine somehow had resonance in the early 20th century with this violence that happened, in many cases, you pointed out, among Irishmen?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the legacy of the potato famine is pretty fascinating. And the lack of sufficient British response to the famine did lead to a huge increase in republicanism, Fenianism, and a feeling amongst most Irish that the British had intentionally perpetrated the famine to annihilate the Irish people. And so that anger and frustration is definitely part of, I think, the violence in the early 20th century. And this long-lasting, I remember when I told one of my professors in grad school that I wanted to study Ireland and memory, he said, oh, the Irish, they have a long memory. And he wasn't really wrong about that. But yeah, I think the potato famine especially, but the long centuries of all these rebellions, and then that the Irish were continually kind of pushed into the empire very unwillingly. I think it did explode, yeah, and that definitely is a part of the violence. And is part of, I think, in the Civil War, why the fighting between the Irish is so violent and so brutal, is because for a long time, I think they all thought they were fighting for the same thing, and you know, the one half wanting to take a more measured step to independence and the other half wanting to go whole hog really, yeah, broke them apart, I think, in, yeah, some ways that they didn't expect, probably.
So I hope you didn't turn this off. I know that it's not meant for us, but for the recording. On that memorial in the stained glass window, and the words were glory and duty. Mm-hmm. You know, those seem appropriate words in the setting of a church, in that religious setting. But I wonder, too, if those simply reflected a lot of the motivation at the time that war broke out amongst those young men who very enthusiastically across all of those European countries, you know, very enthusiastically volunteered and went because they really felt like this was their moment. So perhaps that really was the meaning.
Yeah, it absolutely could be. Yeah, and you know, the concepts of you know, duty and honor. I mean, they still had, I mean, they're very Victorian values, but they held a lot of sway, yeah, especially in 1914. Absolutely.
So the comment that the part that you talked about how you have Irish people today who don't know about the Irish participation in World War I, that surprises me. It seems to me that anytime you visit a World War I battlefield, or anytime you talk about British involvement in World War I, you can't avoid the various factions. You know, you had Australian units, you had Indian units, and you had Irish units, and they played prominently. And that, you know, it leads me to think about the monuments that are on the battlefields themselves, and you have British and Australian and even Canadian pilgrimage to those places. And do you suppose, would that have been a way that they would have commemorated if they were able to make those pilgrimages to those battlefield monuments?
Absolutely, and you do see, once all the wars are over in Ireland in 24, you do see in the 20s and the 30s, the British Legion sponsors pilgrimages to, you know, kind of tours basically, yeah, to take families to the French battlefields and the Belgian battlefields. Nobody really goes to Gallipoli, but they do go to the continent. And yeah, that definitely is a way that they attempt to, yeah, connect, especially, yeah, finding your person's grave. The thing I talk about in my research is that that's a very restricted thing, and the only people who had the money could do it. So, you know, if you had a decent income, you were upper class, you could afford to do that. But unfortunately, most families couldn't afford it, especially the 20s and 30s. And if anyone has seen or read Angela's Ashes, you've got a really good idea of how austere Ireland was, even though that's, I think, the 40s. well, 30s, 40s. But yeah, I mean, Ireland as a country is very poor, and so unfortunately, yeah, most people don't have access to getting to, and the government wasn't interested in providing any subsidies or assistance with people going. Oh, I think Aaron has a.
One comment that I'll make is that if you go to Northern Ireland, it's quite different, right?
Yes.
Because the Battle of the Somme and the Ulster regiments played a huge part in that, and you drive through just about any small town and you see the monument to World War I there. The question that I want to ask may be more anthropological than historical, but have you tried tying some of these themes about visuality and the stained glass window to kind of visuality and Irish cultural perception more broadly? You had a largely illiterate population in the Catholic Church, and so iconography was a main way that people got religious messages, and so there's an argument to be made, going back to the Book of Kells, that there's something about the Irish mindset that is particularly visual, and perhaps having these types of monuments like the stained glass window that you showed might be an interesting connection to try to make.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that would be a really useful connection to make. Yeah, that long tradition. And that might also, maybe that also speaks to the National War Memorials Committee's doggedness, and we're going to get this made, whether you like it or not. But no, that is a good idea. And the thing about Northern Ireland, that's why I only look at the South, because Northern Ireland deserves its own book. Because of, the Protestant tradition, and they are much more okay with being connected to the empire. So they do a much better job of incorporating the war into their narrative than the Southern Irish do. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, folks. See you November 10th. Kelly,